Okay, so picture this. I'm sitting in this leadership meeting, right folding chair, shoved behind the real decision makers, just watching Grant take over like he owns the place. Nobody really sees me there, which is kind of the point, I guess. But here's the thing. While everyone's listening to him talk strategy, I'm thinking about something else entirely. A buried legal clause. Schedule B. And yeah, they have no idea it's even there yet. So this Q4 town hall, yeah, it was one of those mornings where everything already feels a little off, even before it starts. The room's packed, people pretending they're relaxed, coffee cups everywhere, laptops open like shields. And then Grant walks in, fresh from Boston, looking like he's been imported specifically for disruption. You can kind of feel it before he even speaks. That shift, okay, something's about to change here energy. He doesn't rush. He doesn't need to. He just takes the stage like it's already his. And right away, he starts talking about streamlining. That's the word he keeps coming back to. Streamlining processes, streamlining structure, streamlining people, even though he never says that last part out loud. But everyone hears it anyway. You know how that goes. He's clicking through slides, smiling like this is all very clean, very logical, very inevitable. Like cutting things down is just another word for progress. And the room, they're nodding along, not because they agree necessarily, but because that's what you do in these rooms. You nod first, think later. I'm sitting there watching all of it, trying to stay neutral. And it's not like I'm new to this. I've been here long enough to see every version of this cycle. Series A. I was the one fixing the credit exposure when we were weeks away from running out of runway. Series B. I built the cost model that basically saved half the product roadmap from getting wiped. Series C, I'm the one rewriting language so investors don't panic when they see how messy the actual numbers are underneath the polished slides. So when I say I've been in the engine room, I mean it. I've been inside the thing holding it together while everyone else was talking about strategy. But Grant doesn't mention any of that, not once. And it's not like he has to call me out directly or anything. He just reframes things carefully. He starts talking about legacy contributors, about shifting people into more supportive optimization roles. Still critical, he says. Just closer to core functions, and the way he says it, it almost sounds nice. Almost sounds like a promotion if you're not listening too closely. But I am listening, and I know exactly what that means. That's me. That's the quiet demotion wrapped in corporate language so soft it almost feels polite. Like they're doing me a favor by moving me out of the way instead of just saying it out loud. I remember just sitting there, face steady, nodding once at the right time, like I'm absorbing feedback, like I'm fine. But inside, it's not fine. It's that slow internal drop, like realizing the floor isn't where you thought it was. And the thing is, nobody reacts. Not really. A few people glance around. A few people pretend they don't hear it. And then it just moves on. Next slide, next metric, next buzzword. Streamlining continues. After the meeting, it doesn't even feel dramatic in the way you'd expect. There's no big confrontation, no final conversation. It's quieter than that, almost lazy. HR sends a Slack message, that's it. Just a polite little notification asking me to coordinate my transition plan by end of day. Like I'm rescheduling a meeting, not being repositioned out of the center of the company I helped build. And then they move me. My new office, if you can even call it that, is basically an old supply room they decided had enough square footage to count as workspace. No windows, fluorescent lighting that never really turns off in your head even when you leave. The kind of place that smells like dry erase markers and old printer dust, no matter what you do. I sit down there and just kind of laugh once because, honestly, it's almost impressive how quickly things shift when you're no longer useful to the current narrative. But I don't say anything. That's the strange part. On the outside, I'm calm, polite even. I answer messages. I acknowledge HR. I nod through updates like this is all just process. Inside, though, it's different. Inside, it's like my brain is already reorganizing everything. Every conversation I've ever had, every number I've ever seen, every decision they've made that didn't quite add up. It's all starting to line up differently now, not emotionally, structurally. Because here's the thing, I've seen this pattern before. I know how companies like this operate when they think someone is just another line item. They assume removal equals silence. They assume displacement equals irrelevance. But they forget something important. Some people don't just sit in systems, some people design the edges of them. And I guess that's the part nobody here really understands about me yet. There's this other layer to everything that happened, something they don't see, something they definitely didn't see in that town hall. It's not loud, it's not obvious, it's not even something you'd think matters until it suddenly does. A legal structure buried deep in the documentation, a clause that looks boring on purpose, something called Schedule B. I don't explain it, not there, not yet, because honestly, they wouldn't listen anyway. Why would they in their version of the story? I've already been quietly moved aside, already categorized, already optimized, but I know exactly where that line sits. I know exactly what it does, and more importantly, I know exactly when it matters. So while Grant is up there talking about efficiency and alignment and all those nice sounding words people use when they're rearranging control, I'm sitting in a room that used to be storage, watching the system from a different angle now, not fighting it, not reacting to it, just observing it a little more carefully than they expect. And maybe that's the part that makes all of this feel a little unstable for them, even if they don't realize it yet. Because I'm not gone, I'm not really out of the system, I'm just positioned differently, and sometimes that's all it takes for things to stop being as simple as they look. So this goes back a few years, before all of this current mess. Back when the company was still in that M&A preparation phase, where everything feels like it's being quietly rebuilt under your feet. You know, that kind of period where nothing is officially changing yet, but everything is already different. Yeah, that one. I was pulled into one of those working groups almost by accident, not because I was high up enough to belong there in the traditional sense, but because I understood the financial architecture better than most people who were actually signing off on it. And once people realize you can translate chaos into numbers, they kind of just keep you around. At first, it was normal enough. Dry meetings, long document reviews, endless legal drafts that all start to blur together after a while. Everything sounded like it was written to discourage reading rather than encourage understanding. You'd get pages full of phrases like notwithstanding the foregoing and subject to applicable provisions and contingent upon certain conditions precedent. And most people would just skim and nod because that's what you're supposed to do when language is designed to exhaust you into agreement. But I don't really work like that. I read everything, like actually read it, slowly, repeatedly. And somewhere in that process, while everyone else was focused on the big obvious parts of the deal structure, I started noticing something kind of interesting. Not a gap exactly, more like an opportunity hidden inside the way complexity itself was being used. Because in these kinds of agreements, the more complicated they get, the easier it is for small things to disappear inside them. Not because people are hiding things maliciously all the time, but because attention is a limited resource. And most legal reviews are built around surviving deadlines, not perfect comprehension. That's where the idea started forming, not as some dramatic plan, not even as anything I would have called strategic at the time, more like a structural instinct. If the system is going to be this layered, this dense, then it can also carry things inside it without immediately revealing what they are. You just have to make sure they look boring enough that no one feels emotionally compelled to stop and inspect them too closely. So when I was asked to help draft what they called a carve-out clause related to equity redistribution, I treated it like a design problem. Everyone else was focused on protecting founder interests in broad strokes, limiting liability exposure, making sure nothing catastrophic could happen during acquisition transitions. Standard stuff, but I started thinking in a slightly different direction. Not what should be protected, but what conditions would have to exist for protection itself to become enforceable in a way that couldn't be casually ignored later. And that's where Schedule B started to take shape. On paper, it didn't look like anything special. In fact, that was the entire point. It was structured to sit deep inside a broader section of legal scaffolding that already looked intimidating enough on its own. I made sure it was nested inside language that required multiple reads just to track the subject of each sentence. The kind of writing where your brain kind of gives up halfway through and says, yeah, okay, this must be standard legal noise. But inside that noise, I embedded very specific conditional logic, not in a programming sense, but in the legal sense where certain combinations of executive behavior would trigger predefined financial outcomes. The trick wasn't making it powerful. Power is easy to notice. The trick was making it feel inevitable and unremarkable at the same time. Like it was just another routine safeguard that any responsible company would include and forget about. I remember spending an absurd amount of time on wording, not because I was trying to be clever, but because I needed it to survive scrutiny from people who were trained to dismantle anything that looked intentional. Every sentence had to feel like it belonged there for reasons unrelated to its actual function. Every clause had to justify its own existence in a way that didn't invite further curiosity. We went through legal review after legal review, red lines, revisions, calls where half the conversation was just people debating phrasing that ultimately didn't change meaning, but made everyone feel like they were doing something important. And through all of that, Schedule B stayed almost untouched, not because it was invisible, but because it was uninteresting. And in these environments, uninteresting is the safest form of concealment. There was one moment I remember pretty clearly. Though a senior legal advisor glanced over the section and kind of shrugged, saying something like it's dense but standard protective structuring. And that was it. That was the win condition. Not approval, not praise, just indifference. Because indifference is what lets things survive. What I built there wasn't a weapon in the way people usually think about it. It wasn't designed to be dramatic or reactive. It was more like a structural failsafe, a way to ensure that if certain lines were crossed, the system wouldn't need anyone to argue about consequences. The consequences would already be written into the architecture itself, quietly, impersonally, almost politely. And the funny part is, at the time, I didn't think of it as revenge or leverage or anything like that. It felt more like documentation of possibility, like writing down what happens when incentives and behavior drift too far apart, just in case someone needed to see it clearly later. I didn't talk about it with anyone outside that room, not because it was secret in a dramatic sense, but because it simply didn't belong in casual conversation. You don't really bring up embedded legal contingency structures at lunch. It's not exactly small talk material, so it just stayed there, sitting inside a document that most people only ever saw in fragments, protected by its own complexity, waiting, not in an emotional sense, but in the same way most well-designed systems wait, quietly assuming that either nothing will ever trigger it, or if something does, it will already be too late for confusion to matter. And that's really all there was to it. No theatrics, no grand intention, just a carefully constructed piece of language buried inside a larger agreement, designed with enough precision that it could sit unnoticed for years without losing its shape. A clause that looked like background noise but functioned like structural memory. At the time, I just saw it as good work, clean design, nothing more than that. So the quarterly planning meeting, yeah, that one sticks. Not because anything physically dramatic happened, nothing got thrown, nobody shouted, but because of how quiet it was in the wrong places. You know what I mean? Those rooms where everyone's pretending it's just another update, but you can feel the decisions already made before anyone speaks. It was early, one of those 9 a.m. starts, where half the room is still half asleep, but trying to look like they've been thinking strategically for hours. Coffee everywhere, laptops open, people sitting just a little too straight. Grant comes in like he always does now, like he's already 5 steps ahead of the room, calm, confident, almost rehearsed in a way that makes it look effortless. He doesn't waste time. That's his thing. Slides go up, numbers, charts, color-coded optimism, and then he starts talking about recalibration of performance incentives, which is just a nice way of saying bonuses are changing, not in everyone's favor, obviously. At first, it sounds kind of harmless. You get used to corporate language doing that thing where it smooths out impact. Words like alignment, optimization, recalibration, they kind of soften the edges of whatever's actually happening. People nod along because that's the rhythm of it. You're supposed to nod. Wait, process later. And then he gets into it. He starts explaining how bonuses this quarter are going to reflect not just output, but what he calls leadership growth alignment. He even pauses after saying it, like it's something meaningful, like it deserves space in the air. I remember just sitting there, watching the screen more than him, because I already knew where this was going. You can usually tell when someone is about to minimize people. There's a cadence shift, a kind of emotional distancing that happens right before it lands. And then he says it. Not my name, not directly. He doesn't need to. That's the thing. He just refers to legacy contributors being moved into adjusted support classifications. Still critical, he says. Still valued, just rebalanced. It's funny how those phrases are always doing double work. On paper, they sound neutral. In reality, they're repositioning language, soft displacement, professional invisibility with better branding. I could feel the room shift a little, not visibly, not in any obvious way, but people register things even when they pretend not to. A couple of glances, a pause in typing, that moment where everyone kind of decides not to react. And then he clicks again. Bonus adjustments. That's where it gets specific. That's where the abstraction stops protecting anyone. He starts reading numbers, one by one, names blended into figures, departments flattened into percentages, and then mine comes up, or at least what used to be my category in their system, $2,500. That's it, after everything, after years of being inside systems before they broke, after catching failures before they became visible, after literally holding financial models together during reporting cycles that would have otherwise collapsed into regulatory risk, $2,500. He doesn't pause. He just moves on like it's normal, like it's just another line item in a very efficient spreadsheet. But then he does something that changes the temperature of the room. He looks up, smiles a little, and says, "Now I know some of you may feel these adjustments are underwhelming, but in the grand scheme of things, we're talking about rounding errors. Let's keep perspective." Rounding error, he actually says it. And for a second, I don't react, not externally. My face stays the same. That part of me is trained, controlled. I've been in enough rooms like this to know what not reacting looks like. You don't give them movement. You don't give them confirmation that they landed anything. So I just sit there, still, neutral. Maybe even slightly attentive if you were reading it from the outside. But internally something shifts. It's not anger right away, it's quieter than that. More structural, like something in your mind just reclassifies the situation entirely. Not emotional anymore, just data. Because I start thinking about what that actually means. Rounding error. That's what he just called years of work that literally stabilized multiple financial cycles. That's what he just labeled as insignificant in front of a room full of people I've mentored, supported, debugged systems for, protected from their own mistakes. And the weird part is, nobody really pushes back. A couple people laugh lightly, not because it's funny, but because it's easier than not laughing. One or two people glance at me, then away again, just as fast. Like they're checking whether I'm going to react so they can calibrate their own. That's the moment I realize something though. Not dramatic, not immediate, just clear. I've been participating in the system assuming recognition mattered, or fairness, or at least internal logic. But standing there, hearing my entire contribution reduced to a rounding error, I realized that none of those assumptions are operational anymore. And that changes how you think. It doesn't make me explode or anything like that. It does something colder. It pulls everything out of emotional framing and drops it into analysis mode. Like my brain just steps back and says, okay, if that's how the system is describing value, then we need to understand how the system is calculating it. Because it's clearly not consistent with reality. And that inconsistency, that's where things become interesting. I remember the meeting ending like normal. Chairs shifting, people closing laptops, soft conversations starting up again as if nothing happened. That's always the strange part. How quickly rooms reset themselves. Grant was already moving on, talking to people like the last 5 minutes were just administrative housekeeping, smiling, shaking hands, reinforcing whatever narrative he thought he just built. Nobody really talks about what was said, not directly. That's how these environments work. Things land, but they don't get processed out loud. I pack up slowly, not because I'm emotional, but because I'm observing now. That's the shift. Before, I would have been trying to understand how to respond. Now I'm just trying to understand how it was constructed. And that's the first time I noticed it clearly. Not just the insult, not just the dismissal, but the structure underneath it. Because someone who talks like that, someone who reduces outputs like that, someone who publicly reclassifies value so casually, they're not just making social decisions, they're making systemic ones. And systemic decisions leave traces. You just have to know where to look. And I think that's the moment everything quietly pivots, not into retaliation, not into emotion, but into something much more patient: observation. Because once you stop taking things personally, you start seeing patterns instead. And patterns can be followed. So after that meeting, I didn't really react the way people probably expected me to. No confrontation, no dramatic email, nothing like that. I just started looking quietly, methodically, the way you do when you're no longer interested in opinions and only interested in structure. It began with something simple. I pulled up old contracts, not the summaries people usually circulate, but the actual full documents sitting deep in the archive system. The kind of files nobody opens unless something is already on fire. I went line by line, not because I expected to find something immediately, but because patterns don't show up unless you let your attention slow down enough to see them. Then I moved to investor decks, the real ones, not the polished external versions, but internal pre-reads, the ones that get edited right before board meetings. There's always a version that gets cut down before presentation. That's where the real thinking lives, honestly. That's where the uncomfortable numbers usually sit before someone decides they're too honest to show. And yeah, I found those too. What I started noticing wasn't a single mistake. It was consistency in how certain liabilities were being described over time. In Q2, they were called deferred obligations. In Q3, they were softened into projected adjustments. And by Q4, they were starting to disappear entirely under phrases like reclassified legacy exposure. Same underlying numbers, different framing every time, always moving in one direction though. Downward visibility. That's when I started pulling emails, not inbox surface level stuff, thread chains, reply alls, the kind of conversations that happen quickly because nobody expects them to be read again later. I filtered for anything mentioning restructuring, liability smoothing, and investor messaging alignment. It sounds boring, but that's kind of the point. Most real decisions hide inside boring language. And then I found a thread from just a few weeks before the last investor update. Grant was on it, along with finance ops and a couple of senior analysts. The tone was casual, almost rushed. They were trying to finalize wording for what they called a legacy debt clearance line item. That phrase alone should have been a red flag, but it wasn't even the worst part. There was a slide attached, a draft, internal only, not meant for final presentation. And on that slide, in a small bar chart tucked almost casually into the middle, there it was, 7.8 million. Displayed like it was just another optimization outcome. A clean reduction in liability exposure, a green arrow pointing down like everything had been neatly resolved, except I knew what that number actually represented. It wasn't clean, it wasn't resolved, it was a composite figure. Deferred compensation, backdated equity obligations, contingent settlements, and one very specific founder era liability that had always been treated as sensitive but unresolved. It was everything they hadn't properly accounted for, compressed into a single visual so it could be presented as progress. And the way it was labeled, that's what mattered. Legacy debt clearance, gone, simplified, clean. But in the actual ledger structure, nothing about those liabilities had been legally cleared. They were reclassified, not removed, which is a very different thing when you're dealing with contractual triggers. That's when Schedule B came back into focus in my head, not emotionally, structurally, because Schedule B wasn't triggered by outcomes. It was triggered by representation, specifically. Misrepresentation of deferred liabilities in certified financial communication, investor-facing communication, board-acknowledged reporting. That distinction mattered more than anything else. And this 7.8 million figure, it wasn't just large, it was precise. It sat right above the threshold that had been embedded into the clause years ago, not randomly, intentionally, carefully. I remember staring at it for a while, not because I was surprised, but because alignment like that doesn't happen by accident. You don't casually land on a number that cleanly intersects with a legal trigger unless something has already drifted into very specific territory. So I started verifying. I pulled recorded calls first, internal investor updates, the ones where leadership presents quarterly performance narratives, auto-transcribed, time-stamped, stored in compliance archives. Most people forget those exist after the meeting ends. I didn't. I went through them slowly, listening more than reading, looking for phrasing consistency, how they describe liabilities in real time versus how they describe them in documents later. And there it was again. The same language shift in live calls. It was still acknowledged as outstanding exposure, something to be managed, something ongoing. But in written summaries afterward, it became resolved, or cleared, or reallocated. Words that imply completion without requiring actual closure. That gap, that's where everything sits. Then I cross-checked timing. This is where it started getting less abstract because timing is what turns patterns into accountability. The investor call where the 7.8 million figure was presented happened on one date. The formal compensation restructuring approval happened just a few days later. Different systems, same quarter, same reporting cycle. That mattered. Because Schedule B wasn't interested in intent. It was interested in sequence. If certain representations and certain structural changes happened within the same fiscal window, and if the numbers aligned beyond a defined threshold, then it didn't matter how it was framed, the mechanism became eligible. That was the design. Not dramatic, not emotional, just conditional logic embedded inside legal language that most people never fully read. I remember sitting there, switching between tabs, contract on one side, email threads on another, investor deck in the middle, call transcripts on the third screen, just aligning everything like pieces on a board. And slowly, it stopped feeling like separate information. It started feeling like one continuous structure, the same number appearing in different contexts, the same liabilities being reshaped across documents, the same narrative of efficiency being used to describe what was essentially reclassification of unresolved obligations. And every layer I added, it didn't contradict anything, it reinforced it. That's usually how you know you're not chasing noise anymore. At some point, I stopped looking for new information and just started confirming existing alignment, like checking whether a bridge is actually structurally connected on both ends. And it was, cleanly, almost too cleanly. That's when the tone shifted internally. Not urgency exactly, more like precision replacing curiosity. Because now it wasn't about discovery, it was about validation. Making sure every condition that had been quietly written into that clause years ago actually existed in the real world at the same time. And they did, all of them. The number, the timing, the classification shift, the executive certification language in the reports, even the way it was presented to the board under phrasing that implied approval rather than review. It all aligned. And the strange part was, nothing about it felt forced. It wasn't like digging for evidence that didn't want to be found. It was more like assembling something that had already been left partially visible, waiting for someone to connect it properly. I leaned back at one point, just looking at the screen, not really reacting anymore. Because once everything lines up like that, emotion becomes kind of unnecessary. It doesn't help you see anything more clearly. What matters is structure. And structure, at that point, was already speaking for itself. At some point, once you've mapped enough of the structure, you stop trusting your own interpretation completely. Not because you're unsure, but because consequences at this level don't really care how confident you feel. They care about accuracy. So I didn't move forward alone after that. I reached out. There's this one person I trust in the legal side of things. Not someone flashy or senior in a visible way. More like one of those quiet institutional minds who've seen enough corporate cycles to recognize when something is technically ordinary, but structurally dangerous. The kind of person who doesn't react fast. But when they do, it means they've already checked twice. I didn't send a dramatic message, nothing like that, just a short note, asking for a read, no framing, no persuasion, just documents attached and a simple request to review for structural validity. If you over-explain at this stage, you contaminate the response. I've learned that much. It took a while before they replied. When they did, it wasn't immediate agreement or alarm. It was slower than that, careful. They asked questions first, clarifications, version checks, timestamp confirmations. They weren't reacting to the conclusion, they were reconstructing the path that led there. That's always a good sign in legal contexts. It means they're not trying to agree or disagree. They're trying to verify. I remember sitting there going through their responses like a checklist. Each question tightening the focus a little more. Each confirmation removing ambiguity. No emotion in it. Just alignment checks between clauses, timestamps, approvals, and reporting language. At one point, they paused and just wrote something like, "If the documentation is accurate as presented, then yes, conditions appear structurally satisfied." That sentence sounds simple when you read it now, but in practice, it's not simple at all, because structurally satisfied in legal terms doesn't mean anything is happening yet. It means the system no longer has ambiguity preventing enforcement. It means the conditions are no longer theoretical. It means the mechanism is no longer hypothetical. I didn't respond right away. I just read it a few times. Because there's a difference between suspecting something is valid and having someone trained in legal risk architecture confirm that it holds under scrutiny. One is intuition, the other is exposure. After that, the conversation shifted, not emotionally, just functionally. We started going through clause interpretation line by line, not to debate intent, but to confirm trigger thresholds, sequencing logic, and jurisdictional enforceability, the kind of details that only matter when you're past the point of speculation. And every layer we checked held. That was the part that changed the atmosphere. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but gradually, like pressure building in a sealed system that still looks normal on the outside. At one point, they asked me something I didn't expect. Not about the clause itself, but about readiness. Whether internal systems were prepared for execution conditions. Should validation escalate to formal activation review? That's when it stopped being abstract. Because it's one thing to have a legal mechanism sitting in documentation. It's another to acknowledge that it might actually transition from document to action. I told them I wasn't moving anything forward yet, just preparing. And that's what I did. Back at my end, I opened the internal compliance system, the one that most people only interact with when something has already gone wrong. It's not built for creativity. It's built for controlled response, structured escalation paths, audit logs, permission layers, time-stamped execution records. I navigated into the section that most people never touch, legacy clause monitoring and conditional trigger frameworks. It looked boring on purpose. That's always how these systems are designed. The more serious the function, the less visually interesting it is. No dramatic buttons, no obvious alerts, just fields, rules, and quiet logic waiting for inputs that most people don't even realize are meaningful. I started reconstructing Schedule B inside the system, not activating it, just mapping it into executable form. Each condition had to be translated into system-readable logic, not paraphrased, not interpreted, directly aligned with original contractual language. That's where most mistakes happen in corporate enforcement systems. People start summarizing instead of replicating. I didn't do that. I kept it exact. Condition 1, verified input source required, investor-facing liability representation. Condition 2, executive certification matching compensation restructuring approval window. Condition 3, aggregate liability figure exceeding defined threshold within reporting cycle. Each line had to match documented language precisely enough that there would be no argument later about interpretation. That's the part people underestimate. It's not the decision that creates enforcement risk. It's ambiguity in translation between legal language and system logic. I wasn't going to allow that gap, so I built it carefully, slowly, almost like assembling something fragile rather than powerful. Then I moved to the trigger layer. This is where most systems would normally stop. But Schedule B wasn't designed to stop at identification. It was designed to wait for confirmation alignment across multiple independent validation sources. So I set the structure for multi-source confirmation, legal review input, internal compliance verification, external counsel acknowledgement. Each one required explicit time-stamped confirmation before anything advanced. Not because I expected disagreement, but because redundancy is what makes execution defensible. Then I paused, because there's always a moment like that. A quiet gap between preparation and potential activation. A space where nothing is happening yet, but everything is positioned so precisely that movement almost feels unnecessary. I didn't hit anything final. I didn't trigger anything. I just saved the configuration in draft mode, but even that has weight. Because once a system like this exists in structured form inside compliance infrastructure, it doesn't go away. It becomes visible to the right people at the right time, even if it isn't active yet. And that's where the inevitability starts to form, not from action, from alignment. After that, I closed the system and just sat for a moment, not thinking ahead, not reacting backward, just acknowledging that everything was now structured in a way that didn't require interpretation anymore. That's usually when you know the process has moved beyond personal control. Not because something has happened, but because everything is ready for what might. The executive retreat was one of those places that tries really hard to feel relaxed, but somehow still smells like performance review. You know what I mean? Polished wood, too bright lighting, name tags on everything. Even the water bottles had branding like hydration was part of the strategy. Grant loved it there. Of course he did. He moved through the space like it was built for him. Like every conversation was just another extension of his own presentation deck. He was in full rhythm by the second session, talking about scale, efficiency, underperformance, all those familiar words that start sounding like personality traits after a while. And then he started doing this thing where he framed the company story in layers, past, present, future, clean narrative arcs. He had everyone leaning in, like they were listening to something meaningful. But it was really just control dressed up as vision. That's when it happened. Not directly, it never is. He pulled up this internal slide set, something meant for alignment sessions, team cohesion, that kind of thing. But buried in it was a visual segment showing what he called legacy structure drag. And there it was, a blurred collage of internal profiles, anonymized but not really anonymized enough. You could still recognize patterns, roles, context, history, and mine was in there, not labeled, not named, but framed in a way that didn't leave much to interpretation. Positioned under language about inefficiency and emotional attachment to outdated processes. It wasn't explicit, but it didn't need to be. The framing did all the work. He didn't say anything personal. He didn't have to. That's what makes it effective in that kind of room. Plausible deniability wrapped around a narrative. I remember sitting there just watching it for a second longer than I needed to. Not reacting, not visibly, at least. Because that's the thing people always expect, right? Some kind of emotional response, frustration, defensiveness, something they can point to later. But I didn't give them that. Instead, something shifted internally, not anger, not even really disappointment anymore. It was more like classification, like my brain just stopped treating it as interpersonal and started treating it as structural data. So I opened my laptop, not dramatically, just quietly, and I started documenting. Every slide, every phrase, every framing choice that tied individual roles into negative narrative structure. I wasn't reacting to it anymore. I was indexing it, timestamping it, linking it to prior internal communications where similar language had been used. Because once you stop treating these things as isolated moments, they start forming patterns, and patterns are what matter when things move from perception to record. He kept speaking up front, unaware of the shift happening in the back row, still building his story, still reinforcing his version of reality. But now it was just material. I captured screenshots where needed, not everything, just enough to preserve context. Then I started cross-referencing with internal performance reviews that had quietly shifted language over the past few months. Subtle changes, reframing contribution as dependency, experience as rigidity, stability as resistance to change. It all matched. That's the part that makes it stop feeling random. It stops being a moment and starts becoming a record. At one point, I wrote a simple note in my system log, pattern of reputational framing against legacy contributors, correlated with internal restructuring narrative, potential retaliatory alignment. No emotion in the wording, just structure, because structure is what survives scrutiny. Later that evening, I didn't go to any of the social parts of the retreat. I stayed in the room, just going through everything again, organizing, verifying, making sure nothing was interpreted loosely. Every claim needed a source. Every observation needed traceability. That's the difference between reacting and building a case. And somewhere in that process, I received the first external confirmation. It wasn't dramatic, Just a short message from Legal Review on the investor side. Acknowledgement of receipt of structured concern. Preliminary alignment with documented concerns regarding liability framing and internal reporting consistency. No conclusions yet, no decisions. Just recognition that the structure being presented internally didn't fully align with externally visible reporting integrity standards. And that was enough, because it meant it was no longer just internal observation. It was now something being seen from outside the system too. I closed the laptop after that, not because anything was resolved, but because the direction had already changed. The information wasn't just sitting anymore, it was moving outward, slowly, carefully, but definitely forward. It happened at exactly 3:12 p.m. Not roughly, not around that time, exactly. Grant was mid-sentence in what he probably thought was just another routine finance sync. One of those meetings where people talk about projections, pipelines, efficiency metrics, all the usual language that makes everything sound stable even when it isn't. He was standing at the head of the table, stylus in hand, pacing slightly like he always did when he thought he was in control of the room, and then his phone vibrated, just once. Nothing dramatic on the surface, but you could see the shift immediately, not in the room, but in him. That tiny pause where confidence doesn't break, but it hesitates. He looked down. I wasn't in the room. But I could picture it exactly because I've seen that moment before in different forms. The moment someone reads something that doesn't fit their version of reality. On his screen, Schedule B activation notice. Pursuant to previously executed conditions, compliance threshold met, external validation confirmed, legal execution initiated. No ambiguity, no interpretation window, just structure becoming action. He didn't speak at first, just read. Then he looked up, like the room might explain it to him. It didn't. You could feel the confusion ripple outward before anyone even said anything. That's how these rooms work. Silence spreads faster than language. Then he tried to interrupt it. He reached for his laptop, pulled up internal systems, probably searching for some trace of override, some missing context, some procedural gap he could exploit. His hands moved faster than his thinking at that point. That's usually how panic shows up in people who are used to being in control. He opened shared drives, nothing. He checked compliance dashboards, already updated. He tried Slack, messages already in motion, legal, compliance, board liaison. And then he said it out loud, like saying it would change what it meant. What is Schedule B? But the system had already answered that question. Because at the same time he was looking for explanations. The legal confirmation layer had already locked in execution status. Not theoretical anymore, not pending, active. You could see it in the way the room stopped participating in his narrative. People weren't reacting to him anymore. They were reacting to their own inboxes, phones lighting up, notifications syncing, internal alerts cascading through systems that most people never think about until they suddenly matter. Then came the board escalation. Not a meeting, not a discussion, a notification chain that bypassed normal hierarchy because the trigger conditions had already moved it into enforcement territory. Legal was first to speak in writing, not voice. Clause activation confirmed. Conditions validated across all required sources. Execution authorized under pre-approved governance structure. No debate, no hesitation. Then finance compliance followed, adjustment protocol initiated, asset redistribution pathway engaged, and that's when it became real in the most irreversible way. Because Schedule B wasn't symbolic, it wasn't advisory, it was structural enforcement embedded into the company's own framework. It meant numbers didn't get negotiated anymore. They got reallocated. $7.8 million in reclassified liabilities, the same figure that had been presented, reframed, and minimized in meetings before, now moved under enforced redistribution logic out of executive discretionary framing into protected stakeholder allocation. Clean, automatic, final. Grant was still talking at one point, or trying to, but it didn't land anymore. His words were just noise against system-level execution. He wasn't leading the meeting now, he was watching it move without him. That's the part nobody prepares for. Not the decision, not even the trigger, but the moment when authority stops responding to you. 2 floors below, I was sitting at my desk when the confirmation came through. No celebration, no dramatic sound, just a system message. Schedule B execution complete, redistribution finalized, compliance audit record sealed. Then another line. External legal counsel, no further action required. All conditions satisfied, and that was it. No more uncertainty in the structure, no more open loops in the system, just closure. I leaned back in my chair and didn't move for a moment. Not because I was overwhelmed, but because there wasn't anything left to process in the same way anymore. The system had already done what it was designed to do. And for the first time in a long time, everything actually matched the numbers. And yeah, that's pretty much how it ended. No big speeches, no dramatic moment where anyone suddenly understood everything. Just systems doing what they were built to do, and numbers quietly catching up to the story people tried to rewrite. It's strange how fast confidence disappears when it stops being backed by structure. Anyway, if you've been following along, feel free to like and subscribe, nothing forced. Just if you enjoyed it, there's more where this came from.